welcome today's webinar on Progress for Providers for Managers. My name is Michelle Livesley, and my job today is to take you through the webinar and then have a question and answer session at the end. Today I'm going to be sharing information about this workbook, the Progress for Providers, checking your progress in using person-centered approaches for managers, and how this can be used to check out how well provider services are doing in delivering person-centered support. Have you ever met a provider who said they aren't person-centered? Neither have I. And there's probably a fair bit of truth in that. There's a desire to be person-centered from the majority of provider organisations. But sometimes what we know is the practice doesn't match the rhetoric for a whole range of reasons. Now, my background is as a provider manager, so I'm not theorising when I'm saying any of this. And if you'd have asked me a few years ago, was my organisation person-centred, I'd have said yes. In fact, I might have said hell yes and been quite confident about it. But if you'd have then asked me, well, how person-centred are your services in planning with people, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being just started and getting started, and 5 being excellent, I might have said we're a 4, because we had a long history of this where I worked. We've been learning a lot from it over time, had lots of support about it. So I would have said we were doing pretty good. But if you'd have asked how person-centered are we when it comes to people choosing who supports them, recruiting their own staff, I would have probably said, ooh, maybe a 2, because I know we've got pockets of good tries and good practice, but it's definitely not something that we're doing well across the board, and we're probably still struggling to include people who don't use words to communicate. So what this tool does, it helps us to break down person-centered practices into bite-sized chunks so that we can be clear on what's going well and where we've got room for improvement. The whole concept of person-centered can be a big umbrella term that can feel overwhelming. So breaking it down to those bite-sized chunks can feel really helpful. The workbook complements the vision of the government in relation to transforming adult social care, and with the guidance around reforming care support, where people being in control of their services and support, and services being tailored around them rather than people being slotted into existing services. It really fits with that and complements it. But what it also does is it acts as a practical guide to providers on how to do that. So we know where we want to be, but the workbook helps us to think about how we get there as well. A little bit of background about this tool. This tool was developed following the development of the first Progress for Providers workbook, which was checking your progress in delivering personalised services. And this was a high-level workbook that helps us think about everything to do with the organisation that might need to develop or change in order to deliver on the personalisation agenda. And within that, there was a section on how person-centred your organisation was. We had feedback from providers and managers from those provider organisations and commissioners that actually we needed to be more specific about what do we mean by being person-centered. How can we break that down, and how can we accurately measure ourselves against that? So that's how this tool was developed. It was based on feedback of people wanting a more detailed look at being person-centered and person-centered practices. In these times of austerity, where expectations on providers are high, but budgets are being stretched to the maximum, there's a real risk that we economise when it comes to investing in teams. Training can really feel like a luxury or icing on the cake. However, as the role of support changes and evolves in these changing times, it's never been more essential that we invest in developing super teams. Clearly, uniforms are optional. So how do we use the tool? It's really simple to use. Takes about 45 minutes if you're going to do that with people who know the service well. And what we do is there are 3 sections within the workbook, which I'll take you through shortly. and in each section there are some subheadings. Each subheading has 5 statements, and you're invited to tick the statement that's closest to how you would describe your service. So if you're just getting started, say in an area like person-centered recruitment, if you're just getting started, just thinking about it, you might tick statement 1 or 2. If you think you've made some progress, so like I described earlier, you might tick the 3rd statement. If you're doing well and making good progress, you would confidently tick the 4th box. If you've really thought about this well, you've been implementing it, and it's something that's happening across the board, that would demonstrate excellent progress, and that would mean that you'd be ticking the 5th statement. So it's pretty simple to use. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 is the score that you get. So there are 3 sections, and I'm going to talk about each of the sections, but I'm not going to go through each subheading. What I will do is focus either in a general way on the section, or I might pluck out 1 or 2 specific areas to look at in more detail. So section 1 is person-centered thinking tools and approaches. Section 2 is using person-centered thinking tools and approaches to support individuals to have choice and control in their lives. And section 3 is where we think about using person-centered thinking tools and approaches to create a person-centered culture within teams. This is my one-page profile. So throughout the workbook, what we do is we help the manager and staff to think about developing their competency in delivering person-centered practices. However, in order to be competent, we need to ensure that they've had the necessary training and coaching and support to do this. So section 1 is all about the knowledge, skills and understanding of those managers and staff that help us to deliver person-centered practices. So our learning about implementing person-centered planning approaches is that in order to do this well, being person-centered must be extended beyond the people that we support, but to employees as well. So in many organisations, all staff have a one-page profile regardless of the role, and this is used in a variety of ways, from sharing what's important to them and how best to support them at work, to using it to get the best match between them and the people using their service, to being used in person-centered supervision and appraisal. I know one provider organisation where if you're going to apply for a job to work with them, you start to fill out your one-page profile in the application pack, which is a great way of saying this is our expectation of you, to share of yourself and to let us know how we can support you to be at your best. Now, I could do a whole webinar on the benefits of using one-page profiles at work, but I won't. One good thing to think about is how, if you've not introduced this as a concept, how you do it. In Hull, the Assistant Director of Learning Disability Services wanted all of their staff, as well as everybody who uses their service, to start with a one-page profile. But there were a lot of people who were in the service, working in the service, who'd been there a long time, and didn't necessarily see the benefits of this or the reason for doing it. So what Tracy, who worked in Hull, did was she led by example, and she developed hers first as one of the most senior people in that part of the organisation and shared it, and in doing so led by example and showed people that she didn't expect them to do anything that she or other leaders in the organisation didn't expect to do as well. In a Northwest provider organisation called IAS Services, when Ruth became the new CEO, she used hers to introduce herself in the newsletter and her new role. And again, what she was doing was modelling the change that she wanted to see in others. What we've learned over time is that just being person-centred with people who use services fails at implementation if we don't think about and how do we create systems within the organisation that are person-centred and ways of working with staff who implement person-centred practices in being person-centred as well. So a one-page profile is a great way to start this. We also need to think about supporting team members individually to work in person-centered ways, and developing and supporting teams in a collective way to work in person-centered ways. So one of the things that we know is that training on its own is not enough to support and sustain the changes that provider organisations want to see. Therefore, what we need to also be considering is how well are we doing in embedding person-centered thinking in work as usual. How would you score yourselves in supporting your teams to do this? Are we taking training from training to habit, or is there room for improvement around that? In section 2, we're really focusing then on the people who use your services. So section 1's thinking about the managers and staff and their skills and knowledge. And section 2 is thinking about how they use that skills and knowledge to increase people's choice and control. There are many subheadings in this, but I'm only going to pluck out one or two to help us think about. So one of the areas that seems to have really become paramount in providers and commissioners' thinking is this area of thinking about outcomes. So we've got outcome-focused commissioning, we've got outcome-focused reviews, and we need to think about outcome-focused services as well. So there are many ways to help people think about their outcomes and what they want for the future. Some have been with us a very long time, such as using tools like MAP and PATH to really capture the vision of the person's future, and they're great tools to use. One of the tools and processes that's really helpful to use within a provider organisation is the person-centred reviews process. And this is one of the most effective ways of helping a person and those who know and care about them, along with their service provider, to develop outcomes for the future, based on an analysis of what's important to the person now and in the future, and analysing what's working and not working. So this process is increasingly becoming embedded into providers' ways of developing outcomes for people and reviewing how competent we are as a service in delivering those. I recently facilitated a person-centred review in probation services with a young man who was on a life licence for committing a robbery. And Kevin has given us permission to share his story and to share the outcomes from his story. So the person-centred review took place, and for him it was the first time that he'd been in the room with all the people who he would need to help him move forward within his life. So Kevin was adamant he wanted to reduce his dependency on methadone. He was adamant that he wanted a place to call his own. He wanted a place that he would call home. And he wanted to get work as well. And what he previously had to do was see his probation officer, see his drug worker, see somebody around accommodation, and these would all be separate meetings and not necessarily feel joined up. So for Kevin, having everybody in the room along with him and his mum who could actually help him plan his desired future and commit to actions made a massive difference for him. Now, the review worked really well for Kevin, and everybody understood not just the things we wanted to achieve, but because we'd taken the time to think about what was important to him, they could really help him figure out how he could do that in a way that made sense to him as well. I'm really pleased to say that Kevin has gone on now since then. He's managed to come off methadone entirely. He's managed to, with help, secure accommodation that he's really proud of. And his next step, what now he's settled, is starting to think about getting some paid employment. But the person-centred review is a great way to think about how are we focusing on people's outcomes. Another area within the workbook is thinking about helping people to develop their friendships and relationships beyond paid support. And increasingly, as expectations get higher, yet budgets get tighter, thinking about providing support in just a paid way becomes increasingly unrealistic. So good providers are really thinking about how can we capitalise on friends, family and neighbours in order to do this. And that leads us to helping people to be part of their community as citizens. Let me introduce you to Julie. Julie's on the left-hand side, and Julie was a woman who I used to support, and Julie was somebody who, although she desperately wanted to make friends, when we'd looked at her relationship circle, the only people really in her life were her co-tenants and her staff. And Julie was a really sociable woman, but had found it really, really difficult to make friends. So we decided to focus on Julie and think about how could we increase our scores around developing community and bear Julie in mind when we knew that she was somebody who really wanted to make friends. And what we did was we linked Julie to Jean. Jean's wearing the red top, and Jean was a member of staff who had worked with Julie for a long time and was somebody who we really believed could help Julie work through this, and that there'd be some mutual learning, so learning for Julie, but also learning for Jean and for us as an organisation. So what Jean did was she worked with Julie to think about what were Julie's gifts, skills and interests, and where were the places where these might thrive and lead to building relationships. So we had some key pieces of information already. So we knew that Julie absolutely loved being around people and was really sociable. Sometimes she was great at communicating with people, and sometimes it was hard to understand her and she would need help from Jean. So we needed to bear that in mind. Julie had a love of magazines. Every time I went to see Julie, she was flicking through one. And Julie also had great faith. She was somebody who went to church every Sunday, prayed at home, and if anybody was off sick within her team, she would make sure that she was saying prayers for them. So Jean thought about these ingredients and asked Julie if she minded thinking about how she could better develop her relationships at church. So what we thought about, were there any places that Julie was already known where we could strengthen and develop those relationships? And what we knew when we looked at Julie's involvement at church was that she was quite a passive attendee at church. People didn't know her very well. She didn't know them very well. She sat at the back in her wheelchair, often left early because she had a taxi booked, and really wouldn't have been missed if she didn't turn up. It was really important to Julie to go, but we knew that if she was going to really be involved and have a sense of belonging, feel part of the congregation, we might need to do more work. So Jean stayed behind one day with Julie and spoke to the vicar about this and explained that Julie really wanted to make more connections and hopefully they would develop into friendships. And did he have any ideas of where that might work for Julie as well as going to church? And he immediately said, well, we have a women's fellowship group on a Monday night. Julie would be welcome to come to that. It's a smaller group, so she might feel more able to get involved. So Jean and Julie made arrangements and went to the women's fellowship group. Once Jean was there, what she noticed was that other people had slots to do either presentations or every now and then they'd have a guest speaker. So clearly there was an acceptance that people could make some kind of contribution during these women's fellowship sessions. So they went for a few weeks and Jean kept her eye on what was going on, seeing herself very much as a community bridge builder, not just a person who was accompanying Julie to an activity. And came away, and what she realised was that Julie probably could have a contribution, and that could be based on Julie's love of magazines. So Jean and Julie came to me, and I was head of operations for that service, and said, we think Julie could set up a magazine exchange. Julie's love of magazines would mean it would be a great role for her. It would be based on her passion and interest, but also it would do something good for others. And it would be self-sustaining, so we would just need to buy some magazines to start it off and collect them, and then people would swap them over time. So they had a word with the vicar. The vicar said, yeah, that would be great. Perhaps Julie could do that once a fortnight or once a month, and they started. Now, we're about 2.5, 3 years on from that now, and Julie regularly, I think it's gone to once a month now, does the magazine exchange. Julie's relationship circles exploded once she'd done that because she had a different kind of role within the congregation. Everybody knew her as Julie who does the magazine exchange, and she really thrived in that environment and gained in confidence as well. She's now extended that to book swapping as well, I believe. Now, the really nice thing that happened was about a year into doing that, Julie had made a couple of acquaintances who she was more familiar with than others, who kind of she enjoyed sitting with and chatting with, who became much more friendly than she had been before. And Julie became poorly. She had a really severe chest infection. And out of the blue, these two women knocked on Julie's door and with a bunch of flowers, asking how Julie was. Now, that might seem like a pretty ordinary thing to do for URI, but for Julie and for her team, that was the first time that anybody had been to visit Julie who wasn't paid to do so. So that was a real significant milestone for the team, and what they realized was that they were really helping Julie develop relationships and build community. I went to see Julie not long after that and asked her how she felt about people coming around to see how she was when she was poorly. And Julie threw her head back, smiling, and said, I was happy. So we knew we'd done a good job. Since then, there have been loads of other spin-offs, like Julie's been invited to trips out with the group as well. And I suppose what we realized was, if we'd have looked at our scores at the beginning of that journey with Julie, we probably wouldn't have ticked highly. We might have ticked around 2s or 3s around people being truly involved in community, because being truly involved is more than being a tourist. It's having a sense of belonging and knowing that people would miss you if you weren't there. Now I think we could increase our scores because we've intentionally focused on that area to develop. This is another story about somebody who was thinking about building community, but it comes from a different perspective. Sam was an older person who was being supported in residential care, and the manager had been working with people who lived in the home to think about, if they had a small individual budget, how might they use it. So again, she looked at gifts, skills and interests, things that Sam had enjoyed doing in the past. And Sam had said they'd been a keen bowler, although he hadn't seen a game of bowls for 15 years. So what the manager then did was use that interest to think about, how can we get Sam back into the community, reconnecting perhaps with some of his old friends from the bowling club. And the way that she did that was that she used the matching tool to find the best member of staff to go with Sam. And here's an example of the matching tool. So you may be familiar with that, but I'm just going to kind of quickly go through the headings. When we think about the matching tool, we think about what is the support wanted and needed. What is the skill needed from the person who's going to be giving the support? What are the personality characteristics needed? And what are the shared common interests? And clearly, if we're going to get a really good match, we don't only need somebody who will take Sam to Crown Green Bowling fortnightly. We need somebody who can drive him there, because that's one of the skills needed. We need somebody who's confident in mixing with others, because their job is more than accompanying somebody to the activity. It's also mixing with others and being a bridge builder to relationships. That person needed to have a good sense of humour and enjoy good conversation. But most importantly, they needed to have a shared and common interest in Crown Green Bowling. The benefits of this are that both people enjoy the activity. The staff member blends in well into the activity, and that means they can better better bridge build into reconnecting old relationships or forging new connections as well, particularly if they've got a common interest. But what they can also do is they might have friends in their own lives who have that shared and common interest. So again, that could be used to expand somebody's networks as well. So two of the areas within Progress for Providers are around supporting the development of friendships and relationships and building community. And again, one of the things that we ask in the workbook is, how are you doing on that? And I think it's one of the areas where, as providers, we can tick highly because we know people are getting out and about, and that's great. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, do they have a sense of belonging and a sense of contributing to community, or are they merely tourists in their community? So the third section, section 3, is about thinking about developing person-centered culture within teams. And if we don't get the culture right, then the planning suffers and the implementation of the planning suffers. So this is a key element to developing person-centered organizations. And what I am going to do here is just take you through the headings before telling you a little bit about some of my learning from doing this. So in order to develop a person-centered culture, we need to have a shared, clear purpose. This is a purpose that was developed with a team that I was working with, who had been given the challenge to work with 6 people developing their individual budgets into individual service funds and helping them have a much more person-centered service than they traditionally had. But what they'd found when they were doing this was that there were different approaches within the team. There were some people who were really eager to make change and happy to change to do that. And there were some people who believed that their role was to take care of people and keep them safe, not necessarily to help them have choice and control. And within that, there might be some risk-taking involved. So I spent some time with the team really thrashing out what was their purpose. Once they'd done that, that was something that not only could they all sign up to and check out how their approaches to supporting people either took them towards that or got in the way of that, but it also gave them something to measure and to think about how they were progressing in developing their purpose. We also need to have an agreed way of working that reflects our values. So team ground rules are a great way to think about that. If we all agree to it, we might have more ownership over it as well. We need to know what's important to each other and how to support each other well. So this is where we're extending person-centered thinking tools from using them with people who use our services to using them with everybody who is either using services or working within the services. The one-page profile can be used to develop a person-centered team plan, and this can be used to make sure that we understand what matters to people in relation to their work, but we can also use them as a fabulous resource when it comes to implementing person-centered practices. Staff also need to know what's expected of them, and here we would use the donut to figure out with people what their core responsibilities are, where they can use judgment and creativity, and crucially, is there anything that's beyond our responsibility as paid staff as well. Staff also need to know that their opinions matter. In the world of social care, we're not always paid very highly, but value isn't always about pay. Sometimes value is about feeling like we have a say, that people listen to us, that ideas and our concerns are really well listened to, but crucially that we're involved in making change and decision making. So what some teams are doing is developing shared decision making agreements within the team that talk about decisions that the staff make, decisions that the managers make, and decisions that the organisation makes. This is a great tool to use. We also need to see how person-centred are rotas. Are our rotas generic? do people choose from who's on the day based on what the rota gives them? Or are we thoughtfully matching people to rotas, and are they personalised to people who are supported? Do they reflect their outcomes? And do they reflect who they would choose to be supported with? So again, another way of demonstrating truly personalised services is to figure out how well we're utilising rotas to deliver person-centred outcomes for people and person-centred services. Recruitment and selection is also really important. So what we're often good at is listening to people, and we're getting much better at delivering support in ways that make sense to people. Where we sometimes fall down is people having a say over the who does that as well. So thinking about in your organisation where you would score yourself on how person-centred your recruitment and selection processes are is a great way to get a baseline assessment so that you know what you need to build on. We also need to think about enabling risk. Without risk, we don't have quality of life, and risk enables us to grow and learn and find out who we are as individuals as well. So we need to have a positive approach to enabling risk. So does your approach to risk support the person to live the life that makes sense to them without having an impact on other people doing the same? How would you score yourself around risk? We need to know how we're doing around training and developing our staff, how we're doing with our naturally occurring opportunities around supervision and team meetings, because these are the areas that we can really make sure that we're implementing and drilling down person-centred practices within the team and within the organisation. So they're the headings within the workbook, and I just want to tell you how some organisations have been using the workbook. One organisation that I've been doing some work with used the workbook. They got all the managers within 3 regions to self-assess their scores, and they collated their scores. And from that, they got a really good sense of where they thought they were doing really well and where they thought they could improve and do better. And based on that, they commissioned bespoke training that was tailored to developing their scores. Each area had different training because that different training played to the additional strengths and also addressed areas that weren't working for them. I thought that was a really good way and a fab example of giving person-centred support and training to teams, which is really different to slotting people on generic training. So that was one good way of doing it. Another organisation I've worked with made a commitment that every single manager in the organisation, and this was a national organisation, would assess their team's performance using the workbook. They gathered the scores, and then based on the scores across the whole organisation, they used this to develop their training strategy and to think about areas that they didn't need to focus on and they could use time more efficiently in other areas, and areas that they wanted to invest more time in. This was really helpful, not just from a strategic perspective, but what the managers said was in many areas where they thought they were really person-centred, they realised that there was still work to be done. So the benefit of self-assessment is that people aren't telling anybody that they could do better. Managers are owning that for themselves. Other ways to use the workbook, you can use it by yourself for individual self-reflection. You can use it with your manager, and then you can agree some goals and targets within supervision. You can do it as a team and take the team on the journey to think about how person-centred they are and what's getting in the way of that, and agree goals around your team. You can do it as a practice group and do it with other managers within your organisation and think about, so how does that impact on your development programme as an organisation? And you can also use it to follow up on doing the scores around the first progress for providers, checking your progress in delivering personalised services. So a number of ways that you can use the tool. The tools really emphasise capturing evidence of person-centred practices, but one of the things that we always like to remember is this isn't just about getting better paper. This is about making sure that the information that we gather and the conversations that we have help us to help people get better lives. So for people who say, oh, this is another form to fill in, this really isn't, because this changes some of the conversations that we have with people. What I do say is times are tough right now, and sometimes working in person-centred ways can feel like we're pushing against difficulty. But what we know is if we do this and we buddy up with people, then we've got more chance of success. So where this has worked really well is when managers and their staff have supported one another to do this well, and it's not been done in isolation. But what this really does is helps us to listen really well to people and to staff as well in that, and think about what changes do we need to do if we're truly going to deliver personalised services. So that's the end of the presentation for today, and I want to hand you over to Kerry now to see if you've got any questions to ask. And in the spirit of the ground rules that we usually use on training, please remember that there's no such thing as a silly question. Kerry?
Thanks, Michelle. We don't have any questions at the moment. If anybody does want to raise a question before we end the webinar, if you would just put your hand up for me, again, either the grey icon or the yellow icon, just to let me know that you're going to be typing a question in, and we'll wait for you until you've done that. If we don't have any hands raised, we'll take that as you have all the information that you need for today, and that if you have any further questions,